Richard Lawson was a man who seemingly had it all. At 38 years old, he was a successful real estate developer in a bustling suburban town just outside of Chicago. With a charismatic personality, sharp intelligence, and a charming smile, Richard had built a reputation as a man who could close any deal, no matter how difficult. His life was the picture of success: a thriving career, a beautiful wife named Sarah, and a luxurious home in an affluent neighborhood. But beneath the polished exterior of his life lay a dark and twisted secret. Richard was living a double life, and he was obsessed with maintaining it. Richard was born and raised in a small town in Ohio, the son of a strict, authoritarian father and a meek, submissive mother. From a young age, Richard learned the art of manipulation, observing how his father controlled the family with an iron fist. Richard despised his father's harshness, but he also absorbed a troubling lesson: power and control were essential to getting what you wanted in life. As a teenager, Richard developed a keen ability to charm and deceive, using his good looks and quick wit to get out of trouble and win the favor of those around him. After high school, Richard moved to Chicago to attend college, eager to leave his small-town life behind. He studied business and finance, excelling in his courses and quickly making a name for himself as a rising star. It was during his college years that Richard first realized the thrill of leading a double life. He dated multiple women simultaneously, carefully crafting different personas to match each relationship. He found exhilaration in the deceit, the ability to juggle multiple lives without anyone suspecting a thing. After college, Richard's ambition drove him to enter the world of real estate development. He quickly climbed the ranks, his charm and business acumen making him a formidable player in the industry. By the time he reached his late 30s, Richard had amassed considerable wealth and had established himself as one of the most successful developers in the region. His success only fueled his desire for control, and it wasn't long before he decided to take his double life to the next level. Sarah was the epitome of grace and elegance. At 35 years old, she was a former model who had transitioned into a career in interior design. Raised in a wealthy family in Connecticut, Sarah had always been surrounded by luxury and sophistication. Her parents were prominent figures in high society, and Sarah had been groomed from a young age to navigate the world of the elite with poise and confidence. Sarah met Richard at a charity event in Chicago, and it was love at first sight. Richard's charisma and confidence swept her off her feet, and within a year they were married. Sarah believed she had found her perfect match. Richard was successful, charming, and attentive. He provided her with the life she had always dreamed of: a beautiful home, lavish vacations, and the promise of a bright future together. To those around them, Sarah and Richard were the perfect couple. They attended high-profile events, hosted glamorous parties, and were often featured in society pages. Sarah took pride in being Richard's wife, and she supported his career wholeheartedly. She had no reason to suspect that the man she had married was leading a double life, and she trusted him implicitly. Lily Adams was a stark contrast to Sarah. At 32 years old, she was a free-spirited artist who lived in a small bohemian community about an hour's drive from Chicago. Raised by a single mother in a modest household, Lily had always been independent and self-reliant. She had a passion for painting and spent most of her time working in her studio, creating abstract pieces that were slowly gaining recognition in the local art scene. Lily met Richard at an art gallery opening, where he had been invited by a colleague. Richard was immediately drawn to Lily's vibrant personality and her striking beauty. She was different from the women he was used to. Lily was down-to-earth, creative, and unpretentious. Richard was captivated by her authenticity, and he quickly realized that he wanted to make her a permanent part of his life. It didn't take long for Richard to woo Lily. He presented himself as a successful but humble businessman who was looking for a meaningful connection. Lily fell for his charm, and within a few months, they were deeply in love. When Richard proposed to her, she accepted without hesitation, believing that she had found her soulmate. Richard convinced Lily that his frequent absences were due to his demanding job and that he needed to spend time in the city for business. He rented a small but stylish apartment in Lily's town, where he would stay whenever he was with her. To Lily, their life together was perfect, and she had no idea that Richard was married to another woman. For nearly 2 years, Richard successfully maintained his double life. He spent weekdays with Sarah in their luxurious home in the city, attending business meetings and hosting dinner parties with their high society friends. On weekends, he would drive out to the small town where Lily lived, slipping into his second life as a loving husband to her. Richard was meticulous in his deception, keeping two separate phones, two separate sets of keys, and two separate lives. Richard's obsession with control was the driving force behind his double life. He relished the power he held over both women, the thrill of knowing that he was fooling everyone around him. Each time he successfully navigated a close call, whether it was nearly being caught by Sarah or having to explain away a suspicious remark to Lily, Richard felt a rush of adrenaline. The more he got away with, the bolder he became. However, as time went on, the pressure of maintaining two marriages began to take its toll on Richard. The constant lying, the elaborate cover stories, and the fear of being caught weighed heavily on him. He began to experience bouts of paranoia, convinced that someone would eventually discover his secret. But despite the growing stress, Richard couldn't bring himself to end either marriage. He was too deeply invested in both lives, and the idea of losing control was unthinkable. As Richard's double life continued, both Sarah and Lily began to notice small inconsistencies in his behavior. Sarah, who had always trusted her husband implicitly, started to feel uneasy about his frequent business trips. She noticed that Richard had become more secretive, often stepping out to take phone calls or staying out late without explanation. At first, Sarah dismissed her concerns, chalking it up to the pressures of his job. But as the odd behavior persisted, she began to wonder if something more was going on. Sarah's suspicions were heightened when she found a receipt for a hotel in Lily's town among Richard's belongings. When she questioned him about it, Richard smoothly lied, explaining that he had to attend a last-minute meeting in the area and decided to stay overnight. Sarah wanted to believe him, but a nagging doubt lingered in her mind. Meanwhile, Lily was also growing suspicious of Richard's behavior. He had always been attentive and loving, but lately he seemed distant and distracted. He often made excuses for why he couldn't spend as much time with her, claiming that his work was becoming more demanding. Lily, who was deeply in love with Richard, tried to push her doubts aside, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The turning point for Lily came when she found a business card for a high-end restaurant in the city tucked inside Richard's jacket pocket. The card was for a place she knew Richard would never take her to. It was far too formal and upscale for their usual casual dates. When she confronted Richard about it, he laughed it off, saying that a colleague had given it to him as a recommendation. But Lily wasn't convinced. She began to wonder if Richard was hiding something from her. As the months passed, the cracks in Richard's double life became more pronounced. The stress of maintaining two marriages was starting to unravel him, and he found it increasingly difficult to keep his lies straight. He became irritable and short-tempered, snapping at both Sarah and Lily over minor issues. His once impeccable appearance began to slip, and he started drinking more heavily to cope with the pressure. Sarah, sensing that something was seriously wrong, decided to take matters into her own hands. She confided in her best friend, Margaret, who had always been skeptical of Richard. Margaret encouraged Sarah to investigate further, suggesting that she hire a private investigator to find out what Richard was really up to. At first, Sarah was hesitant. She didn't want to believe that her husband could be unfaithful. But as the doubts continued to gnaw at her, she realized that she needed to know the truth. At the same time, Lily was becoming increasingly restless. She couldn't shake the feeling that Richard was hiding something from her, and the distance between them was growing. One weekend, when Richard was supposed to be away on a business trip, Lily decided to follow him. She drove to the city, her heart pounding with anxiety, determined to find out where Richard was going and who he was with. The double life that Richard Lawson had meticulously constructed began to crumble under the weight of his lies, as the suspicions of both Sarah and Lily grew stronger. Each woman, in her own way, was determined to uncover the truth, setting off a chain of events that would lead to the unraveling of Richard's carefully orchestrated deception. Sarah Lawson had always prided herself on being a perceptive and intelligent woman. At 35, she had spent the better part of her life navigating the intricacies of high society, where appearances often mask deeper, darker truths. Despite this, she had never doubted her husband Richard's fidelity until recently. The subtle changes in his behavior, the unexplained absences, and the growing distance between them all pointed to something being terribly wrong. But it was the discovery of the hotel receipt from the small town near Chicago that truly unsettled her. It was completely out of character for Richard to stay in such a place for a mere business meeting. Determined to uncover the truth, Sarah began to quietly observe Richard more closely. She noticed how he seemed to become tense whenever she asked about his work, how he was more guarded with his phone, and how he avoided making plans with her on the weekends. There were moments when she caught him staring off into the distance, his mind seemingly miles away. She started to piece together the inconsistencies, each one a clue in a puzzle she was desperate to solve. As her suspicions grew, Sarah's once unshakable confidence in her marriage began to erode. She found herself questioning everything, every kind word, every affectionate gesture. Was it all a lie? The doubt gnawed at her, keeping her awake at night as she replayed their conversations, searching for hidden meanings. The growing tension between them was palpable, but Richard, ever the master manipulator, deflected her concerns with plausible explanations, leaving her frustrated and confused. Sarah knew she needed more than just her intuition to confront Richard. She needed proof. So she made the difficult decision to hire a private investigator, someone who could follow Richard and uncover the truth without him knowing. The thought of spying on her husband filled her with dread, but she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that something was terribly wrong. If Richard was betraying her, she needed to know. While Sarah was wrestling with her suspicions, Lily Adams was dealing with her own growing sense of unease. The free-spirited artist had always trusted her instincts, and they were now screaming at her that something was amiss. Richard had become increasingly distant in recent months, and his once frequent visits to their small town had become sporadic and hurried. He no longer seemed as invested in their relationship, often canceling plans at the last minute with vague excuses about work. Lily's love for Richard was deep, but it was also tinged with a sense of insecurity. She couldn't understand why he was pulling away from her, and the fear of losing him gnawed at her heart. The discovery of the upscale restaurant's business card in his jacket pocket only fueled her suspicions. Why would Richard have a card for such a place when they had never gone there together? The question haunted her, and the more she thought about it, the more convinced she became that Richard was hiding something from her. One fateful weekend, when Richard told her he had to go on yet another business trip, Lily decided to take matters into her own hands. She followed him, her heart pounding with anxiety and fear. The drive to the city felt interminable, every mile bringing her closer to the truth she both dreaded and needed to know. When she saw Richard enter the luxury high-rise apartment building, her worst fears were confirmed. This was no business trip, this was something much more sinister. Lily's investigation didn't stop there. Her resourcefulness led her to the building's concierge, where she pretended to inquire about apartments for sale. The concierge, unaware of her true intentions, provided her with the unit number Richard had entered, confirming it was listed under the name Sarah Lawson. The realization hit Lily like a ton of bricks. Richard was married to another woman. The shock of Richard's betrayal was almost too much for Lily to bear. She felt as if her world had crumbled beneath her feet. Everything she thought she knew about Richard, every moment they had shared, was now tainted by his deception. The man she had loved, the man she had believed was her future, had been living a lie. The sense of betrayal was overwhelming, but beneath it all, there was a simmering anger. Richard had taken advantage of her trust, and she would not let him get away with it. As both Sarah and Lily began their investigations, Richard himself was becoming increasingly unhinged. The stress of maintaining 2 marriages was starting to break him down, and he was no longer the confident, charming man he once was. The constant lying, the need to keep his stories straight, and the fear of being caught had driven him to the edge of paranoia. Richard began to suspect that Sarah and Lily were growing suspicious of him, though he couldn't be certain how much they knew. Every time Sarah asked him a seemingly innocent question, he felt a surge of anxiety, wondering if she had discovered his secret. His mind raced with possibilities. What if Lily had followed him? What if Sarah had found something incriminating? The fear of exposure was becoming unbearable. To cope with the mounting pressure, Richard started drinking more heavily. Alcohol dulled his anxiety, but it also made him more reckless. He became increasingly irritable and short-tempered, lashing out at both Sarah and Lily over trivial matters. His behavior became erratic, and he struggled to keep up the facade of the perfect husband. In his darker moments, Richard considered ending his double life altogether. He fantasized about disappearing, leaving both women behind and starting fresh somewhere far away. But the thought of losing control, of abandoning the lives he had so carefully constructed, was too terrifying. Richard was addicted to the power he held over Sarah and Lily, the thrill of deceiving them both. He couldn't bring himself to walk away. As the walls of his double life began to close in, Richard's paranoia deepened. He started to see threats everywhere. He was convinced that his colleagues were whispering behind his back, that Sarah was plotting against him, that Lily would expose him. He couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, and his once sharp mind was clouded by fear and self-doubt. The man who had once thrived on deception was now being consumed by it. The private investigator Sarah had hired was a seasoned professional, a former detective who had seen it all. When Sarah first approached him, he could see the pain and desperation in her eyes, the fear that her marriage was built on lies. He assured her that he would get to the bottom of it, no matter how difficult the case might be. The investigator began by following Richard during his business trips, carefully documenting his movements and interactions. It didn't take long for him to uncover the truth. Richard was leading a double life. The investigator's report detailed Richard's visits to the small town where Lily lived, his time spent in the rented apartment, and his interactions with her. The evidence was irrefutable. Richard was married to another woman. When the investigator presented his findings to Sarah, she was devastated. The report confirmed her worst fears, and the reality of Richard's betrayal hit her like a sledgehammer. Every lie he had told her, every excuse he had made, was laid bare in the investigator's meticulous documentation. Sarah felt as though her entire life had been shattered in an instant. But with the pain came a newfound resolve. Sarah knew she couldn't let Richard get away with what he had done. He had deceived her, humiliated her, and destroyed their marriage. The woman who had once been his perfect wife was now determined to make him pay for his betrayal. Armed with the truth, Sarah decided it was time to confront Richard. She planned the confrontation carefully, knowing that it would be a pivotal moment in their lives. She waited until Richard returned from one of his business trips, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and anger. When Richard walked through the door, he was immediately met with Sarah's cold, steely gaze. There was no warmth in her eyes, no trace of the love that had once defined their relationship. Richard knew something was wrong, but before he could speak, Sarah threw the investigator's report on the table in front of him. The color drained from Richard's face as he realized what was happening. His worst nightmare had come true. Sarah knew everything. For a moment, there was silence between them, the tension in the room so thick it was suffocating. Then Sarah spoke, her voice trembling with emotion as she demanded to know why Richard had betrayed her, why he had lied to her for so long. Richard tried to lie his way out of it, to explain away the investigator's findings, but it was no use. Sarah wasn't listening to his excuses. She had heard enough lies. The confrontation quickly escalated into a heated argument, with Richard growing increasingly desperate as he realized he had lost control of the situation. In his desperation, Richard made a critical mistake. He tried to turn the tables on Sarah, accusing her of being distant, of not understanding him, of driving him to seek comfort elsewhere. But Sarah wasn't buying it. She saw through his attempts to manipulate her, and her anger only grew. The confrontation between Sarah and Richard marked the beginning of the end for Richard's double life. The lies, deception, and manipulation that had sustained him for so long were unraveling, leaving him exposed and vulnerable. With his world crashing down around him, Richard found himself spiraling into a dark abyss from which there would be no return. The events that followed would lead to a tragic and inevitable conclusion, one that would forever alter the lives of everyone involved. After the explosive confrontation with Richard, Sarah was left emotionally shattered, but also determined. The man she had loved, trusted, and built a life with had betrayed her in the most egregious way possible. The pain of his deception cut deep, but with that pain came a fierce resolve. Sarah knew she had to take control of the situation, to protect herself from further harm, and to ensure that Richard faced the consequences of his actions. In the days following the confrontation, Sarah began to methodically prepare for the next steps. She contacted a divorce attorney, determined to end her marriage as swiftly and cleanly as possible. There would be no reconciliation, no second chances. Richard had crossed a line from which there was no coming back. Sarah instructed the attorney to pursue a divorce on the grounds of adultery, with the evidence provided by the private investigator serving as indisputable proof of Richard's infidelity. But divorce was only the beginning. Sarah also wanted to make sure that Richard's deceitful actions were exposed to the world. She reached out to a trusted friend in the media, someone who had connections in the high society circles in which she and Richard had moved for years. Sarah knew that once the story of Richard's double life became public, his reputation would be destroyed, and his carefully cultivated image as a successful, upstanding businessman would be shattered. As she put these plans into motion, Sarah struggled with the emotional fallout of the situation. There were moments when the grief and betrayal overwhelmed her, when she found herself breaking down in tears, unable to comprehend how her life had come to this. But each time, she pulled herself back together, driven by the need to see justice done. Sarah's heartbreak had hardened into a steely resolve she would not be a victim of Richard's deceit. While Sarah was taking steps to extricate herself from Richard's life, Lily was grappling with her own anguish and despair. The discovery that Richard was married to another woman had shattered her illusions about their relationship. She felt humiliated, used, and utterly betrayed by the man she had believed was her soulmate. Lily's initial reaction had been one of shock and disbelief, but as the reality of the situation set in, her emotions turned darker. She became obsessed with the idea of confronting Richard, demanding answers, and holding him accountable for the pain he had caused her. Unlike Sarah, who had the resources and support to take measured steps, Lily's response was fueled by raw emotion. She couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Her mind was consumed by thoughts of Richard and the lies he had told her. Driven by her desperation, Lily began to stalk Richard. She followed him whenever he came to visit her, watching from a distance as he interacted with others, trying to catch glimpses of the life he was living without her. The more she watched, the more her anger and resentment grew. How could Richard carry on as if nothing had happened, as if he hadn't destroyed her life with his lies? The betrayal festered inside her, turning her love for Richard into a toxic mix of rage and despair. One evening, after hours of brooding alone in her apartment, Lily made a decision she would confront Richard at his apartment in the city. She needed to see him, to look him in the eye and force him to acknowledge the pain he had caused her. But more than that, she wanted to confront the other woman, the wife Richard had kept hidden from her. She wanted to see the life Richard had built on lies, to tear down the facade he had so carefully constructed. Lily drove to the city, her mind racing with thoughts of revenge and justice. She didn't have a plan. She was acting purely on impulse, driven by the overwhelming need to confront the man who had betrayed her. As she approached Richard's apartment building, her heart pounded in her chest. She had no idea what she would do when she got there, but she knew she couldn't turn back. Richard, unaware of the storm brewing around him, was on edge. The confrontation with Sarah had shaken him, but he was still trying to regain control of the situation. He spent the days following their argument trying to manage the fallout, lying to Sarah about his intentions, promising to make amends, all while desperately trying to figure out how to keep his life from completely falling apart. But Richard's usual charm and manipulative tactics were failing him. Sarah had become cold and distant, no longer responding to his attempts to placate her. The walls were closing in, and Richard felt trapped, like a caged animal. He began to consider more drastic measures, his mind racing with thoughts of how he could salvage what was left of his life. It was on one of these evenings, as Richard sat in his apartment, nursing a glass of whiskey and contemplating his next move, that Lily arrived. She had managed to talk her way past the building's doorman, her desperation lending her a steely resolve that belied her fragile state. As she stood outside Richard's door, her hand trembling as she raised it to knock, Lily felt a surge of anger so intense it almost took her breath away. She could hear movement inside the apartment, and the thought that Richard was inside, living his life as if nothing had happened, fueled her fury. When Richard opened the door and saw Lily standing there, his heart skipped a beat. He had not expected her, not here, not now. The look in her eyes, wild, desperate, and filled with rage, sent a jolt of fear through him. He tried to calm her, to invite her inside and diffuse the situation, but Lily was beyond reasoning. She pushed her way into the apartment, demanding to know why he had lied to her, why he had ruined her life. The argument that ensued was explosive. Lily's accusations flew like daggers, each one cutting deeper into Richard's already fragile psyche. He tried to deny, to deflect, to manipulate Lily as he had done so many times before, but she was beyond manipulation. Her pain and anger had reached a boiling point, and she was determined to make Richard suffer for what he had done to her. As the confrontation escalated, Richard's fear turned to panic. He was no longer in control. Lily's fury was like a force of nature, unstoppable and all-consuming. He tried to calm her, to get her to leave before things got out of hand, but Lily refused to go. She wanted answers, she wanted justice, and she wasn't leaving until she got them. In the heat of the moment, words turned to threats, and threats turned to violence. Richard, cornered and desperate, lashed out in a bid to regain control. He grabbed Lily by the arms, shaking her, yelling at her to leave, but she fought back, her rage giving her strength. The struggle moved through the apartment, furniture overturned, objects shattered, as they battled each other in a deadly dance. And then, in a moment of blind panic, Richard did something he could never take back. He pushed Lily with all his strength, sending her crashing into a glass coffee table. The sound of shattering glass filled the room, followed by a sickening thud as Lily hit the ground. She lay there, motionless, blood pooling around her head where the glass had cut deep. For a moment, there was silence. Richard stood frozen, his heart pounding in his chest, as the reality of what had just happened began to sink in. He had killed her. Lily was dead, her life snuffed out in an instant of rage and desperation. The realization hit Richard like a tidal wave, crashing over him and dragging him down into the depths of despair. The hours that followed were a blur for Richard. He moved through his apartment in a daze, his mind unable to process what he had done. He tried to think, to come up with a plan, but his thoughts were scattered, incoherent. The whiskey he had been drinking only added to his confusion, clouding his judgment and making it difficult to focus. Eventually, the adrenaline began to wear off, leaving Richard feeling cold and numb. He knew he had to do something. He couldn't just leave Lily's body there, but the thought of disposing of her, of covering up the crime, was too much for him to handle. He was trapped, caught between the horror of what he had done and the impossibility of escaping it. In the end, Richard did the only thing he could think of. He called Sarah. His voice trembled as he tried to explain what had happened, but the words caught in his throat. He was incoherent, babbling, his mind unraveling as he tried to make sense of the situation. Sarah, still reeling from her own confrontation with Richard, listened in stunned silence, her heart sinking as she realized the gravity of the situation. Sarah's reaction was one of horror and disbelief. She couldn't comprehend what Richard was telling her. How had things gone so wrong, so quickly? The man she had once loved, the man who had betrayed her, had now become a murderer. The thought of it was too much for her to bear, and she felt a wave of nausea wash over her.